This is the start of a series giving a deep dive on my take of Britain's first author, Gildas, rightly sometimes known as Gildas Sapiens, Gildas the Wise. The Dark Ages is a sort of obscure shadow zone between late antiquity and the early medieval period. Historians have done a very good job of demolishing the concept across most of Europe, but the one place where it might still arguably hold some meaning is post-Roman Britain. If the term means anything, it refers to an absence of historical light, in essence a lack of surviving written records. So it's immediately jarring to find that there is a work addressing the history of 400s Britain and contemporary 500s Britain. Taken together, that is the Dark Age period, so Gildas's mere existence almost renders the term redundant. But a work like his, The Ruin of Britain, doesn't just survive through being written once. To have any chance of reaching down the centuries, it needs to be copied and disseminated. And we know Gildas's work was copied, and known in the areas that became England, Wales, Ireland, Brittany, and northern France. At the end of the 6th century, Columbanus even cites Gildas in a letter to Pope Gregory the Great. Interestingly, he just describes him as the author, which at least gives us some hints as to what Gildas wasn't, if nothing else. He doesn't have any other title. So this was a successful work, and its author internationally known. It was embraced, at least by those with a say in which texts were worth copying. If Gildas sometimes gives us the impression of a voice howling in the wilderness, that certainly wasn't his reality. His voice was appreciated and approved. Although I suspect there may have been another reason for him being copied, which I'll mention later. Anyway, it's worth reflecting on what we might expect of a British author from the 500s. I think it's fair to say, given the traditional history, not much. Surely he'd be some barely literate Briton, about to be swept aside by the Germanic forces of progress. I'm going to use the 1899 translation of Hugh Williams because it's a more literal translation of the original Latin, without too many concessions to modern readers. And frankly, I think the Latin itself, unfortunately we're doing it in English here, but the Latin itself is vitally important to my take. Well, let's read the first two sentences of the preface. Whatever my attempt shall be in this epistle, made more in tears than in denunciation, in poor style I allow, but with good intent, let no man regard me as if about to speak under the influence of contempt for men in general, or with an idea of superiority to all, because I weep the general decay of good and the heaping up of evils with tearful complaint. On the contrary, let him think of me as a man that will speak out of a feeling of condolence with my country's losses and its miseries, and sharing in the joy of remedies. Urbane, literate, commanding, whatever you'd expect, this ain't it. Incidentally, Latinists hate this style of prose. It delights in complexity and therefore gives major headaches for translation. Word order has little bearing on meaning. But the point here is that this is the Latin of the late Roman literate upper elite. Gildas's Latin directly connects him to the trends and styles of the upper echelons of the Western world. This isn't some insular lone voice clinging on to the Roman past. This is someone still connected to mainstream Western European high literary culture. Any remaining thoughts about a dark age are really starting to disappear. The next sentence. It is not so much my purpose to narrate the dangers of savage warfare incurred by brave soldiers, as to tell of the dangers caused by indolent men. This is also very important. I have a theory about Gildas, that he is more than happy to distort the presentation of events to suit his argument and rhetorical style, but always leaves an acknowledgement that he's done it. He isn't prepared to lie. What he's telling us here is a pre-admission that he's going to leave a lot of potential material on the cutting room floor. This isn't going to be a comprehensive record of history. He has a purpose, and it isn't to tell a neutral or heroic history. But he's admitting this from the start. I imagine that if you're still clinging on to the hope of finding a historical Arthur one day, this might give you a bit of a boost. I have kept silence, I confess, with infinite sorrow of heart, as the Lord, the searcher of the reins, is my witness for the past 10 years, or even longer. I was prevented by a sense of inexperience, a feeling I have even now, as well as of mean merit from writing a small admonitory work of any kind. The final sentence of the first paragraph is important because it gives us 3 pieces of information. First, he tells us that he's been thinking about this work for at least 10 years. Personally, I wouldn't be surprised if he's been composing it for that long. and wondering if he dared to reveal it to a wider public. This might well have some bearing on how contemporary the final work actually is. Some of the people mentioned in it might not actually still be contemporary with its final release. It also gives us his description of the work, a small admonitory work. Now obviously this is him in self-deprecatory mode, writing his apology at the start. When he really gets into his stride, it's worth remembering this low-key description of it. Also, it tells us that this is a single work. There used to be some confusion about whether it should be broken up into different texts, but the consensus now is that it should be read as a single volume. The next 6 paragraphs, which I'm not going to replicate here, provide references to the Bible, especially Jeremiah's prophecies being reinterpreted to fit the contemporary church. Gildas directly compares his view of his own times to Jeremiah's in the Bible. Later, Gildas will rhetorically assault 5 kings. Jeremiah also deals with 5 kings of Judah, and Gildas's structure is loosely based on his. But there are significant differences too. For example, Gildas doesn't just pick 5 wicked kings to match Jeremiah's, because actually Jeremiah has 1 good king followed by 4 wicked ones. Also, Jeremiah receives and relays prophecies directly from God, which prefigure the destruction of Judah by Babylon. Gildas is far more self-consciously creating a work for an audience. He actually doesn't predict any specific conquest or destruction. His point is really that sin will lead to ultimate destruction in this world or the next. I saw what great indifference had grown upon the men of our age, as if there were no cause for fear. One of Gildas's key complaints is that the people of his age are not fearful. Primarily, this is a reference to them lacking the proper fear of God and judgment, but it's a striking phrase for Gildas's society in the supposed Dark Ages that, according to its only writer, there's a scandalous lack of fear. This is Gildas describing the 500s, and will contrast vividly with the repeated terrors he reports in the 400s. Reading between the lines, Gildas is describing a long period of calm. Luckily, Gildas explains what he takes from the biblical passages, so we don't have to go over them at all. These things I pondered over with compunction of heart and astonishment of mind. I pondered, if the Lord did not spare a people peculiar out of all the nations, the royal seed and holy nation to whom he had said, Israel is my firstborn, if he spared not its priests, prophets, kings for so many centuries, if he spared not the apostle, his minister, and the members of that primitive church when they swerved from the right path, what will he do to such blackness as we have in this age? An age this to which has been added, besides those impious and monstrous sins which it commits in common with all the iniquitous ones of the world, that thing which is as if inborn with it, an irremovable and inextricable weight of unwisdom and fickleness. As I say, Gildas leaves entirely open what bad thing might result from the crisis he perceives. He gives us some hints later on, but never anything specific. This was a boon to later writers looking to use Gildas for their own ends, as it left them a blank cheque to cash as they saw fit. The complaint that Gildas's own age is typified by unwisdom and fickleness sounds to me weirdly modern, and that may not be as strange as it sounds. One of the defining traits of modernity is actually a revival of ancient views and ways of seeing the world. That's why the Renaissance precedes the modern. The complex urban ancient civilization has something in common with ours that the Middle Ages possibly lacked, at least in Western Europe. It's still surprising to hear a representative of 500s Britain complaining like this. What say I? Do I say to myself, wretched one, is such a charge entrusted to you, as if you were a teacher of distinction and eminence, namely to withstand the rush of so violent a torrent, and against this array of growing crimes extending over so many years and so widely, keep the deposit committed to you and be silent? Otherwise this means to say to the foot, watch, and to the hand, speak. My first comment on this passage is that it's pleasant to have Gildas sharing with us his personal psychological state. There is a long Christian tradition, from Paul through Augustine, of authors writing about how they wrestle with their consciences, so this isn't unusual, but it helps to make Gildas a knowable figure. To an extent, this is all just part of a formal apology expected at the beginning of a work, but it is genuinely believable that he really did wrestle with writing this work and how far to go. In the end, we all benefit from the fact that he decides to go all the way, and then some. Also note that he denies being a teacher of distinction and eminence. There are a few references to teachers in the work. I take this comment not as him saying he isn't a teacher, but saying he isn't claiming to be a uniquely qualified, impeccable teacher. My view is he almost certainly is a teacher. If we picture who in 500s Britain might have been capable of writing such a highly educated work of prose, I don't think it's enough to simply say he's a monk or a clergyman. There's no record of him having a high status in the church hierarchy, being a bishop, for example. I think he's a teacher, and I strongly suspect this work was at least partly designed to be used as a learning resource. It's almost an entire syllabus in itself, covering rhetoric, grammar, Latin usage, history, right rulership, and proper clerical conduct. Also, I think its use as a teaching text would help to explain why it survived and why it was disseminated. The message didn't offend, but perhaps the text itself was recognised as valuable for other reasons as well. Written in the 500s may not have had imperial functionaries talking to each other in this register of prose, but Gildas's own ability proves it must nevertheless have had quality educators, at least for the elites. My view is that Gildas is probably one of Britain's foremost educators at this time, that this puts him in a unique position to articulate concerns which others in his society no doubt also shared. By the way, I can't stand late Victorian archaising, so I'm removing any these and thou and words from the text. I think artificial distancing is the last thing a translation of Gildas needs. Britain has rulers, it has watchers. Why, with your nonsense, are you inclined to mumble, yes, it has these, it has, if not too many, not too few, but because they are bent down under the pressure of so great a weight, they have no time to breathe. So Gildas here actually tells what his society's secular elite comprise. In the Latin, he describes them as principes et custodes, leaders and watchmen. It is obviously a more general term than the specific title of king, held by the ones he later targets. We have no evidence whatsoever for lowland Romano-Britons being governed by kings at this time, so it seems to me that Gildas is here telling us how its leaders might be framed, principes et custodes. We have no way of knowing if these people had formal titles, but it seems quite possible that Latin titles might still have been in use. His comment that if it doesn't have too many, it also doesn't have too few, certainly doesn't mean it has just the right number. His point seems to be that there are a lot of them, but they have very little time for composing a written work. Note his assumption is that they might otherwise be capable of it. He doesn't hint at illiteracy. My guess is he probably teaches the secular elite as well as the religious. It's also worth noting that this is a tacit recognition that his work isn't merely a moralising work kept squarely within the correct bounds for a churchman. This is something wider, stepping into the sphere of politics, and I'd say into the bounds of societal identity. I would suggest that the problem he hints at is that lowland Romano-Britons have many low-level leaders, but no overarching authority capable of making this kind of statement. Also note that in direct contrast to his later treatment of the Western kings, Gildas is sympathetic to this class of leaders. He doesn't just say they're too busy, he says they have no time to breathe. This sympathy makes it clear he isn't here talking about the Western kings about whom he has nothing sympathetic to say. My take is that these are the leaders of the Romano-Britons, and Gildas is making it perfectly plain that they are not the problem. At length, the creditor prevailed and conquered. He said, if you have not the boldness to feel no fear of being branded with the mark that befits golden liberty among truth-telling creatures of a rational origin second to the angels, at least shrink not from imitating that intelligent ass, inspired, though mute, by the Spirit of God. Unwilling it was to be the carrier of the crowned magician about to curse the people of God, it bruised his feeble foot in the narrow path near the wall of the vineyards, though it had on that account to feel his blows like those of an enemy. She pointed out to him the angel from heaven as if with the finger, holding his naked sword and opposing them, whom he, in his blindness of cruel stupidity, had not observed, though the magician, ungrateful and furious, was unrighteously beating her innocent sides. Gildas has an extended metaphor about joint debtors within him, providing him with reasons not to write this work. There's a suggestion that his name might mean pledged one or something similar, so this metaphor could well be a play on his name. I think it's fair to say it's not a joke that comes over well in translation 1500 years later. But it is worth pointing out that Gildas does do jokes, often very schoolboy humour, and I'll be pointing them out along the way. I think they've somehow been overlooked in the commentary I've seen. He then produces at least a vaguely amusing story from the Bible about Balaam and the donkey, and he's comparing himself to the donkey, which again is sort of self-deprecatory, because that's expected in an apology, but he does do it convincingly, nevertheless. In my zeal, therefore, for the holy law of the Lord's house, constrained by the reasons of my own meditation or overcome by the pious entreaties of brethren, I am now paying the debt exacted long ago. The work is, in fact, poor, but I believe faithful and friendly to all noble soldiers of Christ, but severe and hard to bear to foolish apostates. The former of these, if I am not mistaken, will peradventure receive it with the tears that flow from the love of God. The others also with sorrow, but the sorrow which is wrenched from the anger and timidity of an awakened conscience. So he starts again with this talk about debt, more self-deprecation, but then the only reference in the entire work to apostasy, the concept of Christians giving up their religion. Given that he's presupposing that these apostates will be readers of his work, he obviously doesn't mean literal pagans. If any Christians have actually given up their religion and reverted to paganism, Gildas appears to be entirely unaware of them. This is obviously very interesting, given we know pagan Germanic settlers were present, at least in the east of Britain, and that they were indeed having children with Britons. This process does not appear to have been recognisable to Gildas at all. So, to sum up the preface, I'd say this is a very important part of the work. We get to hear directly from Gildas in a way that makes it quite clear that the tone he later adopts is a performance of sorts. This is a carefully constructed display of rhetoric, not a screed. It's urbane, cultured, learned. It tells us it can be seen as an admonitory work that knowingly steps into the political sphere, that's being written because he does not think anyone else in his society is likely to be able to play this role. And whatever complaints he might be preparing to make, the very existence of a Gildas in the 500s in Britain says something very positive about the society in which he lives. An educated elite of some sort has survived the 400s. I say survived, but it's also necessary to point out that we have no British literature from the imperial period whatsoever. We know that Pelagius of Britain did write controversial theological works which haven't survived. There's no reason to think that those related to Britain. I think it's fair, therefore, to call Gildas Britain's first writer. And in my view, he isn't just the first. I think he stands on at least equal terms with many of its more famous later writers. He's deeply underappreciated, and it's partly because, quite wrongly, he hasn't easily been thought to fit into any of our surviving communities. My aim is to resuscitate him.